Evening and welcome. Thank you all for being here. My name is Mike Babin, and I'm the president of the Hong Kong Veterans Commemorative Association. And I'm very proud to be the son of Alfred Babin, a Hong Kong veteran and a member of the Royal Rifles of Canada. Tonight's topic is In Their Own Voices, an oral history project given by Michael Petrou. I'll introduce our presenter in a moment, but first I'll get our administrative work out of the way with a very brief reminder about how the session will be conducted. Now, I do expect that by now, most of you are very familiar with how our events are run and how to ask questions, so I won't go over that in any detail this evening, except to remind you that you can ask your questions anytime by using the Q&A function that you'll find on your screen. We won't answer the questions until the end of the presentation, but just feel free to ask them as they occur to you. Now, this evening, we are trying something new, and you should be able to see closed captions. For those of you who, like me, have some difficulty in hearing, this might be a useful option. To see the captions, look for an icon with CC or captions on your Zoom screen and click on it. The one thing to be aware is that these captions are computer generated, so they're not perfect, and sometimes you will see some odd interpretations of the speaker's words, but hopefully they'll be useful nonetheless. And please note that we are recording this event, and the recording will be available on the HKVCA website, www.hkvca.ca. And don't hesitate to recommend it to your friends and family. I recommend that they watch it. And by the way, those recordings and all of our recordings that you'll find on our website also have closed captions should you wish to use them. Now, Michael Petrou, our speaker, heads a very interesting project at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa to collect stories of the experiences of veterans after war or military service. And to do this, he's interviewed some 200 veterans and family members, and these will be made available through an online portal and will eventually result in a conference and a book. Families of Hong Kong veterans are among those that Michael has interviewed. Now, we in the HKVCA understand very well the importance of preserving our veterans' stories and experiences, and Michael's work is very supportive of this. Michael is historian of the veterans' experience at the Canadian War Museum, where he's leading In Their Own Voices. As I said, that's an oral history project that explores how war and military services have shaped the lives of veterans and their loved ones, and how those veterans in turn have shaped Canada. Michael previously worked as an editor and a foreign correspondent, reporting on war, conflict, and social unrest across Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia. He was a 2018 Martin Wise Goodman Canadian Nieman Fellow at Harvard University and a Chevening Scholar at the University of Oxford, where he earned his doctorate in modern history. Michael's publications include Renegades, Canadians in the Spanish Civil War, and Is This Your First War? Travels through the post-9/11 Islamic world. He lives in Ottawa with his family, and that's where he's speaking from this evening. Michael, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike, and thank you, everyone that's watching. It's a real pleasure to be here and to speak about the In Their Own Voices project. It's a particular pleasure to speak to the Hong Kong Veterans Commemorative Association. Mike Babin was one of the very first people that I contacted when I began this project nearly 2 years ago. And since then, I've been continually humbled by the generosity of members of the organization who I've interviewed and who I've spoken to, and who have been so generous about their memories. I've interviewed 13 family members of Hong Kong veterans, and interviewing veteran George McDonnell and speaking with veteran Phil Dodderich shortly before their deaths were experiences that I cherished at the time and always will in the future. I'd like to begin by showing you something, and I don't know if it'll translate well over the magic of Zoom. Sorry, it's a 1939 silver dollar. And it might not matter if we were in person, because the truth is it's rather worn down and blurred, even at close. My grandfather put it in his wallet the day he enlisted. He carried it through North Africa, Sicily, mainland Europe, and during the liberation of the Netherlands. It was given to him by his high school teacher, and he kept it in his wallet until the day he died, nearly 60 years after the war. I think it became, during the war, a sort of talisman, a good luck charm that some soldiers kept with them because they believed it kept them safe. But I think it became something else. It was likely a reminder of home when he felt scared and lonely. And then after the war, I think it was a reminder of the war. My grandfather, like so many other veterans, never spoke about his wartime experience, but the fact that this was what was kept close to his body his entire life, up to and including when he died, I think speaks to the enduring impact that the war had on him. I'm bringing this up because this impact, this influence that the war had on my grandfather wouldn't show up on normal documentary evidence. He didn't keep a diary. The written records of his wartime service wouldn't speak to that sort of emotional impact that the war had him for the rest of his life. I only would have been able to get at that if I had sat down with my grandfather and spoke to him and asked him, what do you remember when you reach into your pocket and you rub that coin? I didn't. I wish I had, but I have had the opportunity to ask similar questions to other veterans and their family members. And I think that gets at what's special about In Their Own Voices. Now, I should acknowledge for historians present that oral histories have many flaws. We all misremember, we forget, we intentionally forget things that are perhaps difficult or painful. But I think oral history is also especially well suited to getting at a certain kind of history that doesn't always make it into the written record. Generals are more likely to write memoirs in private. Battles are more likely to be chronicled than our dreams or nightmares. So I think oral history is particularly appropriate for what we're trying to do at the War Museum within Their Own Voices. And that's to get at, as Mike said during the introduction, the veterans' experience. And by veterans' experience, I don't mean the recollections of veterans about their wartime lives. I mean, it's what happened when the war was over. How do veterans reflect on their service? How do they handle the transition to being a civilian again? What do they miss? What sort of invisible injuries might they have suffered? Who do they talk to? How, in summary, has the veteran service changed them, and how might it continue to do so? And I think this is yet another reason why In Their Own Voices is a special project. Most oral histories end when the war ends. They're only about the war, but the impact of war and military service doesn't end when war or military service does. It continues to ripple through the lives of veterans, shaping what they do and who they are. And those veterans, or those impacts, don't end with the veterans themselves. They also ripple through veterans' families, communities, and indeed entire countries. That's the final, I think, special feature of In Their Own Voices. And that's our focus on the family of veterans. As Mike said, I've interviewed nearly 200 veterans, from veterans of the Second World War right up to veterans of Afghanistan and Iraq. But we've also interviewed about 40 or 50 family members of veterans, because we know that war and military service also shapes the lives of the loved ones of veterans. And these are questions that we can also uncover by interviewing family members and loved ones. What was it like when your dad came home? What did he tell you about the war? What did you want to know? How has that shaped your own life? So we're trying to understand those ripples and explore those impacts. And my contention, my belief is that the best way to do that is sitting down with people, as I've done and as I will continue to do, and as I've been so lucky to do with some of you, and asking questions. What did you do after you took off your uniform? What friends have you kept? How do you commemorate the sacrifice of those who died? How did your service change you, or how did your loved one's service change him or her and change you and those close to you as well? Now, a good starting off point in a lot of these oral histories that I ask, especially when I'm interviewing veterans of the Second World War, is how did you feel when the war ended? And the Second World War is unique because there was a clear ending, and that's a rich and sometimes difficult difference between veterans of the Second World War and veterans of modern conflicts. I've interviewed about 45 or 50 Second World War veterans. I'm fortunate. I know this is the last window any of us will have into that generation. And I asked them, how did you feel? And the response is often relief. It's contemplating survival is exhilarating, but also difficult, because I think to make it through sometimes years of war, you had to accept the potential inevitability of death. But coupled with that was sometimes the anxiety about what comes next. I've survived, I'm relieved, but now what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And I think no doubt that was the case with veterans of the Battle of Hong Kong as well. But as with so many other things pertaining to veterans of Hong Kong, their homecoming was unique too. It was overlaid with questions of what they had accomplished, whether they had been defeated, was their sacrifice worth it? I want to play a clip from someone that needs no introduction. This is George MacDonnell explaining how he wrestled with those questions and what he wanted his fellow veterans of Hong Kong, especially those under his command, to understand on the long journey home after the war. So bear with me as I try to share my screen, and we'll hope the technology works. And you'll notice there's subtitles across the bottom. I hope that doesn't interfere with the closed captioning that Mike has set up, but it makes it a little bit easier to follow the interview along.
I've been starting for years, and so even on my side, I was infected. I had to be hospitalized for many months to recover. You see, it takes about 3,500 calories per day for an average person. We were fed about 1,200. We went home in a state of virtual starvation.
How were you emotionally coming home?
Well, I was in charge of some 68 men, and so I absolutely had to stay. Well, you see, I told them this: we're not victims of our government. We are victors. The worst mistake the Japanese ever made was to attack Hong Kong and take us prisoner. And that's because when we were sent to Tokyo to work in the Nippon Kokan shipyard as slave labor, we burned it to the ground. And we shut down the biggest naval shipbuilding facility in Japan, which was a massive blow-to-their war effort. The ships were desperately needed to counteract the submarine war against Japan, and we made 8,000 tons of those ships a month. Those two Canadians fought it for a year to burn it down, and they did. And they shut down Japan's largest shipyard completely, something American bombers had tried to do for 2 years up to now and failed utterly. So we came home way ahead of the game, and I told my men, we're not victims, we're not going to die here. We'll never agree with these people. We've lost the battle, but we haven't lost the war. We've done our bit and more than our bit. And every soldier in Canada does what we've done, even after we were captured as slaves. We should be proud of ourselves. And I told them the story of Hong Kong is not how we have been defeated, but how bravely we fought and how long and how stubbornly we defended our areas, which were not to surrender.
This project in so many ways has been a journey of discovery. I try to do as much research in advance as I can before I interview the veterans. We have conversations, but there are always surprises. Eleanor Thompson was a Canadian veteran, and I knew she had been stationed on the West Coast at the end of the war. I didn't know her job until we sat down and spoke at her King City home. Entailed interviewing returning Allied prisoners of war, including of the Battle of Hong Kong, who had been held by the Japanese, and although they had recovered somewhat during their journey home, still bore visible scars that George described, and as Eleanor will describe in a moment. But I love this interview, or I'm grateful for this interview because for me it seems like closing the circle on the return journey that George described, but from someone else's perspective. So let me play that for you, please. You stayed in the Army for a little while after the war, yes?
Yeah, well, to give them time to demob the men. We had that, and then when that was more or less eased off, then I was in Vancouver then, and Army headquarters in Vancouver, and we took a lot of soldiers coming back, or the prisoners of war coming back from Japan, and they came through us. And I had to go up to Vancouver Military Hospital and interview them. And the worst thing was, I mean, they were all they were thin and you know, bones sticking out and everything, but they were jovial. Anyway, this one guy, I was sitting beside his bed, and he was here, and he leaned forward, and of course his nightie came apart, and I nearly flipped. He had no fat on his bum, on his buttocks. He had absolutely no buttocks, and I stared, and what a shock. I'd never seen anybody that thin. I mean, he was thin when you sat and talked to him, his arms and everything, but he had no flesh on his bum. And that was just horrible.
what Eleanor is describing will not be surprising to any of you, from the stories of your own loved ones and of other Battle of Hong Kong veterans. One of the things that's interesting to me is the impact that it had on Eleanor, seeing that, how that shaped her attitude towards her service and how she felt about what she was involved in and what she had accomplished, how she felt about Japanese, how she felt about the veterans. It continued to have those moments, those connections with the returning prisoners had an impact and shaped her for decades after the war. One of the other questions that I ask almost all the veterans that I interview is what they miss about their service, about their war. And it may seem a strange question when so many suffered so much, but almost everyone that I speak to does miss something. For many, it's the comradeship. The American writer Sebastian Junger, who spent a lot of time with American combat troops in the Korangal Valley of Afghanistan, he specifies that this isn't friendship. He calls it brotherhood, what I think is a better term, but not a perfect one. It's love. It's love for people that you might not even like, but that you know that you can rely on for everything. And it's unique, I think, to soldiers, but it also comes with a cost when you lose those comrades. One of my favorite observations about war is by the leftist German poet Bertolt Brecht. His life was torn asunder by the rotten middle of the 20th century, including the Second World War, and he said, he who would live by war must eventually yield something in return. What is yielded is often grief for survivors, but something else too. Here's George again.
I became very, very disturbed because I felt that I had a heavy guilt concern because so many of my comrades had died and I had lived. And so I went to my psychology professor and said, I'm in trouble with this problem. And he asked me a couple of questions. I said, did you do your best? Yes. Do you think you could have changed anything? No. Well, then, son, he said, you're lucky to have survived it. Try to think positively. Work hard at school, and you'll get over it. And he was right. So I needed a little coaching at the beginning.
Explain to me why you felt guilty. What did you feel guilty about?
Because I was alive. And my friends were dead.
One of the fascinating themes in this project for me has been the similarities between veterans of different eras. I want to tell you a story about a veteran of Afghanistan that I interviewed, Benjamin Hertwig, and he describes a family dinner that he had in which one of his relatives brings up the name of one of his friends who had been killed in Afghanistan, and Benjamin becomes visibly upset and he leaves the table. And then his grandfather, who had been very quiet and with whom Benjamin didn't often speak, got up and followed Benjamin into the hallway and put his arm around his shoulder and told him that he understood. Benjamin's grandfather had served in the Second World War They served in different conflicts. They served decades apart. Benjamin's father had actually served on the side of the Axis with the German army, and yet their shared experience of losing people close to you in conflict, in combat, united them in a way that those who hadn't gone through that could perhaps understand or fully appreciate. I think Benjamin and George would probably have understood each other too. I want to play you a clip from a modern veteran, which I think illustrates this and illustrates some of the same challenges that George describes. This is John Barnes, a long-time veteran of the Canadian Army who was wounded during Operation Medusa in Afghanistan.
Now my priorities have changed. I have 2 grandkids, 2 grandsons, 4 and 2. They mean the world to me. I want to be all right for them. And that's kind of what got me to really look into how I was feeling and to get that help I needed, because they are important. I can go through life in my basement, or I can get out of my basement and live my life to the fullest and enjoy my grandkids. And the memories are there, but they don't haunt me like they used to. I still have some nightmares every now and again, not as often, typically around a special event, something I see on TV, like Canada Day during the fireworks, for example. You know, I had some nightmares that night because I had watched the fireworks. I knew I shouldn't have. It just brought back stuff. But for the most part, I'm pretty happy where I am. My physical symptoms are still there. I wake up every day with headaches. I go to bed every day with headaches. My memory's getting worse. Doctors are doing everything they can, but nothing seems to help. But my emotional baggage is certainly lessened. And I've learned to smile a bit more.
Another major post-service transition for veterans, perhaps more so during the Second World War than veterans who are younger, given the time veterans were often away from home and from loved ones, concerns relationships, marriage. My own great uncle Judd, like so many other Canadians, came home from the United Kingdom with a war bride. My great aunt Ave, who died only a couple of years ago. And I've occasionally thought about how little time they must have had together, how little they could have known each other. Twist of fate, perhaps on spur of the moment, cascaded down through generations, including to myself. And that's another theme that we're exploring in their own voices, the impact of family, the reality that war doesn't just affect those who experience it directly, but also those close to them down through the generations. The man on the left is John Reed. He was a veteran of the Battle of Hong Kong. He was heroic in captivity. George MacDonnell speaks of that. His son, who you'll see, Jonathan, on the right, explored his father's actions during captivity, but also his father's return when he got back from Hong Kong, and the impact that would have on Jonathan and on his own family. John eventually largely left his first family, and Jonathan, in one of the most, if I can say this without embarrassing Jonathan, if he's here, one of the most beautifully written books I've encountered, exploring some of these themes, tried to understand what was behind his father's post-war actions, and has also thought, and we discussed this in our own interview, the impacts and the ripples that had down through the years to Jonathan himself. But during our interview, in addition to chatting about how this affected Jonathan. We also talked a little bit about Jonathan's mom, and I want to play that clip if I can.
Your mother, you write when you were working on her behalf or to get pension, you say that she was as much a victim of the war as your father was.
Yes. The war overtook that whole generation, those generations. I see her as a loving, devoted wife, like hundreds of thousands, whose husband went off to war, like hundreds of thousands. She wondered and hoped through the time he was away. In his case, it was such a severe, sudden, complete, disastrous experience for him as a soldier that she was, within several months, now living in the dire fear that he wasn't alive, which she didn't know for half a year, and then all the time knowing he was in the dreadful circumstances he was in. So I can't imagine for her how much stress and strain and worry, endlessly, unceasingly, that would have been for her. And as you know from the book, she lost a child by miscarriage sometime after he was captured. And she had to get through those years. She had to wait and wait and wait, not knowing, sometimes months, if he was still alive.
There's one more common element to the veterans experience that I want to touch on here, and I might begin not in Hong Kong and not even in the Second World War, but earlier in 1936, and that's when the magnificent memorial at Vimy Ridge was unveiled. Some of you might have been there. We have the original models at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, and even those are breathtaking. But in 1936, they unveiled it and they invited veterans of the First World War and especially of the Battle of Vimy Ridge to return. And hundreds did, more than planners had anticipated, which I think speaks to the power that place can have and that pilgrimage to that place can have for those who undertake it. It embodies confronting past sacrifices and perhaps an elusive search for not closure, but perhaps peace. And this has come up again and again with veterans of the Second World War, of Korea. I've spoken to those who've returned to the Netherlands. I've spoken to vets who've returned to Korea. And pilgrimage to Hong Kong and even to Japan has been a common element among my interviews with family members of Hong Kong veterans. And I'd like to play two. The first is Diane Deng speaking about a 2010 return with her dad, Frederick.
Your mother, you write when you...
Oh, my mistake. There we go.
He never displayed anything, because I don't know 100% if he was ever proud that he was a Hong Kong veteran until we took him back to Hong Kong in 2010. And he would, because there was like 75 people in this tour back that Mike Babin had organized. And there was 9 of us plus Dad from our family. And he would be walking through the streets or walking into a building, and the people from Hong Kong would stop him and say, "Could I shake your hand? I'm very thankful for what you did." And I think that really, really made him feel like, wow, that wasn't all for nothing. So that trip back made him then proud. And he didn't, I guess, because the battle was so short and they all got captured, he always sort of thought in the back of his head, wow, we didn't do our best. But he really did do his best. And the Hong Kong people definitely showed that in 2010 when we went back.
That's Diane talking about her dad, Frederick Cooper. And I'd like to play another clip. This is by Robert Ford talking about a trip he took himself to visit the memorial to his uncle Frank, and in doing so fulfilling a promise that he had made to his dad.
He often said, my father, that he had wished that he would been, have been in a position to go to the Saiwan Bay Memorial, where his brother's name was engraved on the granite stone, as he had no known grave because they never recovered his remains. My wife and I were, it was a promise, as silly as it sounds, growing up as a little boy and listening to my father tell, stories of his brother. And like I say, there was like funny stories, a lot of funny stories his brothers would have, and how much, his brother meant to him and how much he missed him. But he really wanted to be able to pay his respects to his brother and be there, but he was never financially or health-wise able to make the trip. As a little boy, I promised him, as silly as that sounds from a little boy, that I would do that. I would somehow get to Hong Kong and, as a Ford, pay my respects to Uncle Frank. So fortunately for me, in 2014, my wife and I, it was a trip that we had saved my entire working career. I retired in 2014 from Ontario Hydro, and we saved vacation money for basically my whole career. We put it aside so that I would be able to afford this trip to Hong Kong as a retirement gift.
What was it like for you and your wife to be there in 2014? Tell me, why did you want to go, and how did it feel once you got there and were able to see these things?
When we got there, the entire day was overcast, threatened rain all day. We were able to see all the sites, as I said, including Mount Cameron. When we were done the tour on Mount Cameron, he was able to take us to the Saiwan Bay Memorial, the cemetery, Canadian War Cemetery. And I find this emotional for me to speak of. I was able to keep my promise. Excuse me. I was able to keep my promise to my dad. And we sat there on a little bench in front of the names, and I was looking at my uncle's name. And as silly as this sounds, a hole opened in the clouds and a ray of sun came down. And it was right on where my wife and I were sitting. And I felt peace. I felt that I was able to fulfill that promise to my dad. And that I thought that was my uncle and my dad, their way of acknowledging that I made it. It was happy and sad, I guess, at the same time.
there's another poem by Bertolt Brecht that I'm reminded of often while doing this research. It's called To Those Born Later, and it contains the stanza, you who will emerge from the flood in which we have gone under, bring to mind when you speak of our failings, bring to mind the dark times that you have escaped. I'm continually reminded how grateful I must be for escaping such dark times, thanks to the service and the sacrifice of those who fought at Hong Kong and elsewhere. It's been such a rewarding experience to learn more about their service and how the service shaped them, to get to know them a little bit better, often through you, and to get to know you and how the war is and your loved one's service has shaped you as well. It's been quite honestly the most enriching project that I've worked on, and I'm grateful to be undertaking it. I'd like to take questions in a second, but maybe before I do, I'll just tell you just a little bit about what we're going to do with the project. Mike mentioned this a little bit at the beginning. We will have an online exhibition, which will feature a selection of interview clips. So turn off the backlight there so you can see my bedroom a little clearer. We're going to have an online exhibition that'll make use of a selection of the clips as you've seen tonight. But everything, all the interviews in their entirety will be stored in our archives. So researchers, students, family members, future generations will be able to access those, and they'll be there for generations to come. We are also creating classroom material, which will make some of these stories more accessible for young people. I am editing a book about the veterans experience. And as Mike mentioned, we will have a conference in 2025 as well. And finally, my deep hope is that these interviews will have lives that we haven't imagined yet. They will all be stored as part of our permanent collection in the museum. And I hope that in the years and decades ahead, as we continually reimagine the Canadian War Museum and launch new exhibitions, these interviews will be a resource that other museum curators will be able to draw on and bring to the public in ways we haven't imagined yet. So that's it for me in terms of what I wanted to share with you. But I'm here for as long as you would like. If any of you have questions you'd like to pass on.
All right, Michael. Very moving presentation. Thank you very much for that. I was particularly struck by your comment about the camaraderie. The term you used was love between the soldiers, and I think we certainly saw that with the Hong Kong veterans. Shortly after the war, they started up their organization, the Hong Kong Veterans Association. They had meetings, they had conventions, they participated in pilgrimages, and you could see in attending those events just how strong a bond there was between those men and the shared experiences that they had. It was really quite something. So to questions from our audience, John Reed actually has a question. Jonathan Reed has a question for you. Did the concept of PTSD come up in the interviews that you? Sorry, John corrects me. It says it's not from him; it's from his wife Janet. But did the concept of PTSD come up in the interviews?
Yes, and often. What's interesting is the Second World War veterans tend to use, and George, you heard George talk a little bit about that, tend to use a different vocabulary than the younger veterans. There simply wasn't the awareness, I think, in that generation. So I recall, for example, Max Dankner, one veteran of the Italy and the Northwest Europe campaign, very young man when he was over there. So he described coming home and his mother finding him in the morning, hiding and crying under his bed and having to go to Sunnybrook and see a psychologist. But he wouldn't use the term PTSD to describe what to me sounds like PTSD. The veterans of Afghanistan, I think, are much more familiar with that. There's a more openness to discussing the emotional and mental impact of military service and of trauma. So yes, the veterans of the Second World War do discuss PTSD. 2 or 3 of them have used the term PTSD, I think, often prefacing that by saying, I hadn't heard of this, or what we now call. But even those who don't use that term describe, I think, what we would recognize as the same phenomena. So.
I think I know my own father, when he came back, he told me years later that he felt that the things that he told the interviewers, like Eleanor, I presume, he felt that they didn't believe some of the things that he was telling him, that there was a failure to understand or to acknowledge what had happened to the veterans. And PTSD, however it was manifested, just wasn't recognized as a thing in 1945.
Absolutely. I recall that from our interview, Mike. Yeah, I mean, there's the shift, I think, in acknowledging some of the impacts of war on on the mental health of those who experience it. I think we've come a long way. I mean, tragically, I think your dad's frustration, I think, has been proven correct by the really difficult statistics concerning average lifespan of Hong Kong veterans, let alone the death toll of those who died or were murdered in captivity. I mean, those numbers speak for themselves.
A few comments, one from an anonymous attendee who says, my father, Harry Drury, would have been one of the returning POWs that Eleanor would have helped. And I'm sure that was interesting for this person to find out. And Glynis says, amazing project, Michael, heartrending and a jewel for future generations. And thank you for your presentation. And Anne says, this isn't a question, but I remember my father said to me that when his fellow comrades would lose hope is when they would die soon after. Interesting comment.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I have to say, maybe I can just respond to that. I am aware that in interviewing Second World War veterans more than 75 years after the war, it's perhaps not a representative sample. Those who might have had particularly acute struggles are unlikely to have lived to have been 98 or 99 or 100. So that's I'm very fortunate. It's an enormously unique, I think, experience to be able to interview some of these men and women in 2022, 2023. But I am aware that it's, even to live this long, you're 1 out of the 5,000, 1 out of 10,000, and perhaps to have lived this long and to have been a Second World War veteran, it is not representative of everyone who served in the war. So.
Right. Ross says many veterans were very reluctant to discuss their experiences and wants to know if you've been able to acquire letters home or diary entries or other such things that might fill in some of the blanks.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. So and that's common, certainly, is a reluctance to discuss it with family members. Yes, diaries, letters, I mean, all these things supplement and fill in gaps and often enrich the interviews. And I can recall one or two interviews with family members, having diaries and having letters that add to what they personally recall. It's been, I knew this on a certain level as a journalist, that yes, it's a common feature, I think, of veterans not to discuss their experience, even with those very close to them. I think that's absolutely true. As I mentioned, my own grandfather didn't. I have also been very pleased and humbled by the willingness of so many veterans and family members to open up to me. And I think that's a combination of the passage of time. I think it's because I'm not a loved one, I'm not close to them, that perhaps there's that distance that perhaps paradoxically makes it easier to discuss certain things. I think there's a natural, I mean, as painful as some of these memories are, and this is when I was alluding to my past career as a journalist, I do think there's the natural and very human instinct to tell your story. It's sometimes difficult to tap into that, but we've been very fortunate that so many people have been willing to do so in the course of this project.
Judy says, thank you for your presentation. It's stories like this that help me to know my dad better and what he went through. He was a Winnipeg Grenadier. His name actually was Riley Prieston. And he lost his younger brother in Hong Kong, William Prieston, who was killed in action. And his name is on the Saiwan Memorial Wall. And unfortunately, Judy was 5 years old when her father died in a farm accident. So, for Judy, it's interesting to hear these kinds of presentations. She says she learns something new every time she hears something like this. So thank you, Judy, for that comment. Another attendee wants to know, were there many veterans who talked to Veterans Affairs about their experiences?
I mean, certainly, in the course of applying for compensation and injuries and pensions, yes, that's beyond the scope of the project that I'm digging into myself. I mean, occasionally it does come up when discussing, for example, the post-war training that veterans were given. I know this was instrumental for George McDonnell and many other veterans. So certainly when I'm trying to learn more about the impact that the Veterans Charter had on Second World War veterans, that will come up. It came up, as you mentioned, Mike, in our discussion concerning the reluctance of Veterans Affairs to seemingly believe what Alfred discussed. The kind of really gritty details of the Veterans Affairs response and policy isn't part of this project. I mean, I could recommend Peter Neary's Return to Civvy Street for those that are interested in it, but it's not the focus of my own work.
Okay. And interestingly, one of our viewers wants to know if it's possible to get hold of you. I think what he's asking for is whether you're contactable by email or otherwise.
Absolutely. If Michael, Michael Petrou, Petrou at warmuseum.ca. And Mike, I don't want to burden you, but if people didn't quite catch that, please feel free to pass on my email.
Okay, that's great. We'll do that. Anybody who didn't catch that can also write to president@hkvca.ca. That'll reach me, and I'll put you through to Michael. Let's see, what else do we have here? Some comments from Warren. saying that this isn't a question, but my father, Stanley Gold, was a survivor of the Omini coal mine near Nagasaki. He was a Winnipeg Grenadier who did not share very much. And he goes on to say that my mom said that even 50 years after, he would whimper at times in his sleep, which I think was common. I think a lot of the men had nightmares, or they talked in their sleep, or they had some sort of a physical manifestation of the horrible experience that they had during the battle and during their imprisonment. Helen, also making a comment, not a question. Her father, Morris McCarran of the Royal Rifles, told me that hope and faith were needed to survive in the camps. And he also wanted his kids to not be biased towards the Japanese people, which is an interesting comment, I think. And she says, thank you. John says, in around 1980, many Hong Kong vets were interviewed for a similar project, and tapes are in the Canadian War Museum. My father was interviewed, and in fact, that's true. There are interviews done with the veterans, but with a slightly different focus, I think, than your project. And certainly family members were not interviewed. But he wants to know, he said his father was Armand Bourbonniere. Did any of your research delve into those tapes for additional information?
Not yet. They might. I mean, my goal, or one of my many goals, is to bolster the oral history program at the Canadian War Museum. I hope this continues. But what I'm doing now builds on previous work, such as the 1980s interviews. I haven't, and we're acquiring new oral history interviews, and I have colleagues that are conducting some of their own. I certainly may, if there's gaps, I may revisit some of these. If I can maybe speak frankly, I've done, I think, 190 interviews so far. If everyone is an hour, 90 minutes, 2 hours, to listen to those, would be several weeks of 40-hour. So I'd love to get at these 1980s interviews. I'd love to get at material at the Imperial War Museum and elsewhere, and God willing, one day I will. But right now I have such a rich trove of material to work with just through my own interviews that I've been negligent about going beyond what I've done myself. So. Well,
I don't see any evidence of negligence, Michael. This is a terrific project, and you're doing a lot of work on it. Anne makes a comment. My dad suffered after the war, and the government left him to deal with his trauma on his own. I think a lot of the families of Hong Kong veterans feel that the government basically neglected their fathers or their grandfathers for years and years and years. It took them a long time to get the pension situation sorted out. It took a long time before the compensation was paid to the veterans for their slave labor and for their pain and suffering. It seemed like for a long time we had a government that just didn't understand or didn't want to understand.
Yeah, I know my colleague Tim Cook writes about this. I believe in the Fight for History, and perhaps also in the second volume of the Second World War, that sort of neglect, official neglect, yeah, and how perhaps Canada's desire to build and cultivate relations with Japan after the war might have colored its response to how it treated its own citizens who were imprisoned by the Japanese during the war.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Let's give last call out for questions. If you do have a question for Michael, now's the time to ask, or if not a question, a comment, please feel free. Well, Anne is asking, is it possible to still get compensation from the Japanese for the slave labor? Some businesses are still around. Did you want to comment on that, Michael, or I can comment if you...
I don't have an answer. I'm sorry, Anne.
Okay, well, I should mention that the compensation that I mentioned actually didn't come from the Japanese, it came from the Canadian government. The Canadian government paid out to $20,000 or so to each Hong Kong veteran, so it didn't come from Japan. There has been a movement to try to extract some money from some of the Japanese companies who employed slave labor. And I don't know where that stands, to be honest with you. It looked for a while like there might be some success. These were mostly Americans who were pushing for this. And where that stands, I'm not sure. I should look into that and find out. But I know for a long time there was basically no movement on the subject. Okay. Any other questions? We'll go once, go twice. All right. Well, Michael, thank you. This has been a fascinating presentation, and we truly do appreciate all of the work that you and your colleagues have been putting into doing this research, and we're looking forward to the publication of the website and the book, and the event that you alluded to in 2025. That's going to be fascinating. We'll all be looking forward to that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. I hope so, and I hope we can.
And thanks to everyone for watching this evening. A plug for next month on Monday, October 23rd. Our virtual event topic will be a tour behind the scenes of our newly refurbished and revamped website, given by our own webmaster extraordinaire, Jim Trick, and Laurie Atkinson-Smith. So find out how the vast store of data on our website and in our Facebook group is helping families and researchers learn about the battle and its veterans. And if you have questions about our online services, that's going to be the time for you to get answers to them. So watch for your emailed invitation around the beginning of October. So our mission is to educate Canadians on the Battle of Hong Kong and on its effect on the survivors and their families. I hope you found that this and our previous virtual events have contributed to supporting this mission. And if you've missed any of our previous events, as I mentioned earlier, you can watch the recordings at www.hkvca.ca, and feel free to recommend them to your friends and family. Thanks again, everybody, for attending tonight, and thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.